them during the presentation simply because there are some issues which I outline right at the start, and then I return to them during the talk. So it might happen that you have a question after 5 minutes of the webinar, which actually will be answered towards the end. So feel free to ask questions. Agnieszka and I will have a look at these, choose a few that I will try to answer and do my best at the end. So 5 shades of culture, right? Challenges in multicultural teams. Let's get started. For the start, consider 4 things which obviously go well together. There's a coconut, rubber bands, a newlywed couple, there is an onion. But consider culture where building a relationship seems like a hard task. People don't seem very friendly. It's hard to make small talk or chit chat. They don't smile and ask you how you are all the time. There is a hard shell. Think of the Japanese the first time you meet them. But once you invest some time, you join people in a karaoke bar, maybe you share a few rounds of drinks, you notice that there are cracks on the outer shell. And on the other side, there is something soft. That's a basis for a long-time relationship. Rubber bands? Well, in most cultures, for example, in the US, a rubber band is held tautly between 2 fingers, and it's relaxed only periodically, maybe during a staff party or a Christmas party. So it's how you conduct yourself. In Thai culture, a rubber band is mostly hanging loosely. And the interesting bit is that the word sanuk in Thai means work and fun at the same time. A pair of newlyweds sounds like a bizarre thing, but think about this. Moving in to live with somebody who you don't know very well could mean there will be plenty of disagreements. There will be need for clear and direct communication. Consensus and compromise building will be key, and you will also have to master the skill of reading between the lines. Now, today we'll see that communicating with people from certain countries means that we will have to adopt communication patterns found in young marriages. And last but not least, an onion. Well, cultures have many layers, that's obvious. But maybe what's less obvious is that when we start removing these layers and dissecting, cutting onions into smaller bits, it may bring some tears to our eyes. Working across cultures is great, but it can also be a challenge, and it's not always an enjoyable experience. So why shades of gray? What does Mr. Gray, Christian Gray, have to do with it? Well, when you look at the definition of the expression shades of gray, you will find out that it means a state of uncertainty where things are ambiguous or a situation where things are unclear. Working with people from different cultures will mean that only a few things remain black and white. Most of them have a gray shade and are difficult to sort out. Today we'll look at 5 shades of gray as far as multicultural communication is concerned. We will use real case scenarios provided by experts and researchers, also some of my own experiences. We will try to understand the reasons for some strange or unusual behaviors, and whenever possible, we will try to address these and look at solutions. Now, from my experience and many other people I have worked with, these solutions are rarely easy and clear-cut. So, culture, it's quite obvious, right? Isn't it? But for the start, let's just look at 4 common statements and consider these in your head. Would you say they're true or false? The first one, good business practice in one culture will mean the same in another. Being well-traveled means the same as being a culture expert. It's enough to be open-minded and tolerant to differences. And finally, constructive criticism is universal across cultures. Have you thought about these? Well, would you be surprised if I told you that these statements were largely wrong or flawed? Take the first one as an example. Though we live in a globalized world when we often think we're similar, maybe the same, more often than not, we're not. There are dozens of very experienced and successful managers who failed when working with and leading multicultural teams or work abroad. They blindly copied behaviors they brought with them, also strategies. Adaptability, learning, reflecting on how you do things will get you far when working with multicultural teams. Traveling. It can help, right? But it doesn't automatically mean we know it all. Also, being an expert these days doesn't really mean you are a practitioner. Traveling doesn't mean living. At the end of the day, 6 weeks are not the same as 6 years. And speaking a language doesn't really mean that you can understand all of the hidden messages behind it. However, this experience, traveling experience, is a great place to start with. What about the third statement? In the past, this term cultural awareness was a buzzword. Everybody talked about it. Listen to a lecture, do a quiz, take part in a team building event, maybe even look at a case scenario. That was the formula. But cultural awareness can no longer be just a passive trait. It has to be more active. Asking questions, perhaps doing informal research, maybe talking to or learning from more experienced colleagues. Finally, adopting your behavior. These are the steps we all have to take. Start with opening your mind, that's for sure, but don't just stop there. Constructive criticism and negative feedback, because that's what it boils down to. Have you ever wondered why in some countries teachers give feedback to their students in a completely different way? Did you know that in some countries actually the use of a red pen is forbidden? And why is it that 11-year-old kids in British or American school read comments like, keep trying, well done? And their French partners or students often read two errors, skills not acquired, rewrite. How we give and receive feedback starts at a very early age and could in fact be attributed to a lot of these cultural differences. So let us start with the first shade of gray, with the first shade of culture, the context. Why this one? Because it's a building block. It will cascade down and have an impact on all of the other shades. Context will mean what type of language we use, whether it's direct or indirect, how we build relationships, how we disagree, what kind of feedback we give to other people, and finally, what is the meaning of yes when we say it? In order to do that, let us look at the first scenario for today. This one actually comes from Erin Mayer. She is an author and a researcher, and we'll say more things about her. Let's have a look at this one. To give you a little bit of background information, we'll see a conversation between two people here. Pablo Diaz is a Spanish manager working for a large textile factory in the south of China. We will see him in a conversation with Mr. Wu, who is Chinese and is also one of his team. Before we look at what they say, it's also important to notice that Mr. Diaz has a favor to ask of Mr. Chan. It looks like we're going to have to keep the production line running on Saturday. I see. Can you come in on Saturday? Yes, I think so. That will be great help. Yes, Saturday is an important day. How do you mean? It's my son's birthday. How nice. I hope you all enjoy it very much. Yes, thank you. I appreciate your understanding. Do you think that Mr. Diaz will see Mr. Wu on the factory floor on Saturday morning? Highly unlikely. I personally wouldn't bet my money on it. But how can we tell there is a misunderstanding in the air? Where's the catch? Well, on the surface, Mr. Wu speaks good, correct English. He understands the questions, and there seem to be a lot of yeses and mutual understanding, but in fact is a complete misunderstanding. Why? Mr. Diaz takes words at face value. To his ears, a yes means okay. He is quite certain the other person is coming, and that's the message he reads. Mr. Wu, however, who as we know is Chinese, relies more heavily on context. He doesn't obviously want, in his own cultural perspective, to offend his superior, his boss, by saying no. The message Mr. Wu reads is, Mr. Diaz understood. I can stay home with my family and celebrate. In the world of conflicting messages and cultural layers, reading between the lines, or as the Japanese say, listening to the air is a crucial skill to have. Now, let us look at one specific particular word which is used more than once in the story. Yes, I think so. Yes, Saturday is an important day. And yes, thank you. I appreciate your understanding. The meaning of the first yes were rather obvious. It's a no, but I can't say it directly, not in your face. You're my boss, and I don't want to offend you. This is simply not how we do things in China. The second yes, my daughter's birthday means a day off. This is not China. This is also true about Russia or Ukraine, right? Birthdays are special days. They are to be celebrated. And the last yes, thank you for letting me stay with my family. So what does that tell us about cultures? Mr. Diaz, who is Spanish, comes from a low context culture where messages are clear. He expects being direct and transparent. He says what he means, and he means what he says. Mr. Wu, on the other hand, comes from a high context cultures where communication is a lot more subtle and indirect. It's simply impolite to say no to your boss. Cultures are different. They can be divided using many different criteria, but the main one seems to be context. Now, the devil's in the details. Remember the marriage metaphor from earlier on? It was actually created by Edward T. Hall, a famous American sociologist and anthropologist. We've talked about newlyweds, but just for a second, think about a married couple, people who've been together for 20, 30, 40 years. They don't have to use so many words. There is a meaning behind gestures, silent days. It makes me think of my dad. In the past, every time we ordered flat pack furniture from IKEA, quite often after 30 minutes of playing with the screwdriver, he would announce that he had a headache and had to lay down. Well, it was obvious to us in our family what it meant. So using the context to decode hidden messages, that's our first challenge. So let us look at some characteristics, and let's start with low context cultures now that we know that Spain is one of them. The first characteristic, here verbal messages are explicit, communication is direct. American kids at school are learned a simple rule: say what you mean what you say. Nonverbal communication is not so significant. Being transparent is how we define ourselves. Reading between the lines should be kept to the minimum. This is not about guessing. Business is about playing your cards straight and playing them right. Written communication may be preferred to verbal one. In low context cultures, we love written contracts. We use signs. We bounce back emails. Relationships are superficial. They often begin and end quickly. These are not coconut cultures. These are peaches cultures. Very soft on the outside, but actually very hard on the inside. Events and tasks are scheduled, and change is fast. Time is money. What about high context cultures? Now that we know that Mr. Wu comes from China, which is one of them. Well, here, nonverbal elements, the voice of your tone, gestures, facial expressions, they all play a big role. Communication is implicit and indirect. There are many different layers of it. It's another onion. There's politeness here. There's hierarchy. There is gender. There's religion. And there's also your age. These all will play a role. Good communication is an art. It's nuanced. It's sophisticated. Relationships build slowly, depend on trust. They tend to be long-lasting. They are our coconuts, remember. Time is not easily scheduled. Change is slow. Think about Ghana or Nigeria, countries in the constant process of change and flux. People prefer verbal communication to written one. It's clear for everybody who's been to a train station in Germany and a train station in Bangladesh. It's clear that in Germany and in Europe, we love messages, written signs. Now, I have mentioned Erin Meyer earlier on, a writer, a lecturer, and a researcher, very influential, and author of a must-read and a bestseller. I highly recommend The Culture Map. Her book has been used by managers, top executives, but also she has lectured at places such as the Harvard University. Many examples I will use in today's webinar are actually drawn from her work. Now, some of you might be familiar with the Hofstede framework, which is used for analyzing and comparing cultures. Now, Erin Meyer took that framework to the next level, and she introduced 8 different scales, which allow us to look at cultures if we want to compare them. You can see these 8 scales right here on the screen. Today, because we only have 60 minutes and time for 5 shades, we will only address some of them, but we will start with the first one, the one about communicating. Notice that countries which are to be found towards the left end of the spectrum are countries where people do expect direct communication. Towards the right end of the spectrum, you can find many Middle Eastern, Asian, and African countries, where, as we now know, communication is much more subtle. There's more to read between the lines. Now, if you think about Pablo Diaz, who was originally Spanish, and even though Spain is still somewhere in the middle, when compared to China, the gap is big enough to say that Spain is a low context culture when compared to China. Now that we know that this is a difference which may impact on communication, let us look at some possible solutions. So what about high context business partners? Let's say there's a Polish company doing business in the Middle East or in China. Well, start with listening and focus on what is meant, not said. Try to read between the lines. Pay attention to the meaning of yes. It has many shades. It's important what is said after the word yes is actually produced, and be prepared to read and know between the lines. Try not to judge too quickly. Learn as you go. Cultures are different, but it doesn't mean they're worse or better. If you're not sure, even though it might mean repeat yourself, ask for clarifications, maybe in a written form, maybe in an oral form. And language. If you don't want to end up with a simple yes or no, perhaps use more open-ended questions. What about low context business partners? Working with people from Holland, people from Denmark, people from the US. Well, they value transparency, that is for sure. So be clear and specific. Learn to recap. At the end of a meeting or a call, summarize your main points. Don't get offended when you receive direct negative feedback. It may in fact be a sign of honesty. We will have a look at this notion, feedback, later on. Now, always explain your purpose. Remember, time is money. Don't waste someone's time. Why are you writing? Why are you calling? And finally, though it's tempting to be as direct as the other people, be careful. You might end up actually sounding offensive. It's tricky. Now, what about multicultural teams? A lot of us these days work with people from both low context and high context cultures. What is maybe one piece of advice that we could offer? Multicultural teams will need low context processes. Clear communication and direct messages tends to be the most effective way for people who come from different places. So, are you ready for the second challenge? Remember what we said, low context cultures, what they say about good communication, it's direct, it's transparent, it's explicit. Now, awareness is the first step, we know this. Cultures are different, languages are different. There's hierarchy, there's age and gender. Now, what do the Hindi word cow and a Business Insider journalist have in common? Another tricky combination, right? Now, in Hindi, the word kal can mean both yesterday and tomorrow, depending on the context. Totally confusing. Now, Mark Abadi, who works for the Business Insider, spent 2 years living in Malaysia, and as he says in an interview, he never heard a single no. The word yes can have many different shades. Yes is a very easy word for us, Westerners. It means that's right. It means agreement. It means okay. However, as we've already seen it Remove it from that context, transplant it somewhere else, and things get, well, very messy. Have you ever wondered why people from India are often referred to as yes people? Well, let's try and find out why. And let's use another scenario to illustrate this issue. This time I'm going to draw not from Aaron Mayer, but from Sean. He's an American who's a blogger and a martial artist, and he's been living in the Southeast of Asia for many years. In the example below, we will see him in a conversation with a friend, a Chinese girl whose name is Cherry. They shared a flat together, and Sean wanted to ask her whether he could organize a little house party. Let's have a look at what happened. Can I bring a couple of friends to your house for dinner? Yes, but my house is a terrible mess. No problem. I'll come over and help clean it up. Yes, but I don't have enough dishes and glasses for many people. I'll buy some paper dishes and plastic cups for this occasion. Yes, but my stove is too small to cook a lot of food. I'll order a restaurant to deliver food. No, Tom. Why can't you understand? I don't want your friends in my house. Well, why didn't you just say so? Even a more casual setting, here, being direct, could be tricky for a Chinese person. At the end of the day, Tom is female, and Cherry Tom is male, sorry, and Cherry is female. Now, remember Mr. Wu and the Chinese factory? Yes, in the word of an Asian can have many different meanings. It's a really great word. It can mean, I understand what you're saying. Maybe we can try that. I hear you. I agree. Let's take it further. Let me think about that. And finally, yes, I'll do it. Now, often pay attention to what is said after yes. The absence of a no can come from many different sources. For example, in India, it's connected to the notion of politeness. It's a social system where people live in various different castes, and they don't really interact between each other that much. That means it's quite easy to offend someone you're not supposed to. In China and its Confucian values, tensions and disagreements are to be removed at all cost. Preserving harmony is a very important thing. Hence, it's impolite for the Indians to say no and unproductive for the Chinese to say so. In other words, communicating with people from high context cultures really means being a word detective, picking up the clues as you move along and reading between the lines. In the words of Simon Vetter, a business coach and author, we may think we are all speaking English and may even speak the same words, but we may not be on the same page. There is another layer to the meaning of yes and no, and maybe the absence of both of these words. Now, welcome to the world of conflicting messages. For example, when communicating with the Japanese, we'll see that the word yes, unfortunately, is not the only hard nut to crack. In the second story we'll see today, in this section, we'll also think about Sean. Remember Sean, that American living in the southeast of China, fan of martial arts? Well, Sean here recalls a situation from a business context. He used to cooperate with a Japanese factory, and at some point during his cooperation had to ask for a copy of a government document, a formal document, in order to perhaps have it translated. He sent an email to a sales rep on the other side in the Japanese company to get the certificate. Now, this is what he heard, and this is what happened next. Unfortunately, the certificate is very difficult. It is written in the Japanese language, replied the sales rep. After 2 weeks, we didn't receive the certificate. We wrote another letter. Please send the certificate, we'll have it translated. The sales representative replied, Yes, but it's written in very difficult technical Japanese. Most Japanese people don't know the technical words. 2 more weeks passed without any certificate. So another email. Technical words are okay. We found an engineering professor to translate for us. Please send it anyway. The certificate never arrived. Now, can you read between the lines on this occasion? Apart from yes, what's the other tricky word with a second meaning? It's difficult. Western difficult is easy to understand. It means that something is hard or tricky, but we will try our best to solve the challenge. Asian difficult is a lot more complex. It can have 3 meanings. This task is impossible. I don't want to do it. And finally, it's difficult, but I'll try my best. Now that we've seen that the word yes has many shades, we can also see the word difficult used by the Japanese. Let's have a look at some potential tips and solutions. Number 1, think about your questioning techniques. We've already said it. Perhaps modify how you ask questions. Use more open-ended questions rather than closed-ended questions. Build your relationships. Now, coconut cultures, very often before people do any business with you, they need to find out who you are. What is the name of your wife? Where you live? How many kids you have? And do you have a pet? It does pay off to invest time. Now, this can be particularly difficult when we work with people who are located in a completely different part of the world. It can be even more difficult right now in time when we can't really travel on business. We rely on communicating using Skype or Zoom or other online tools. But still, it does make sense to build relationships. And finally, since people might not be so open, perhaps use different layers of verification and feedback. Think about round robin. Think about sending emails. Think about asking people what they think before the meeting, so to speak. Agree on rules they feel comfortable on, recap summaries, and think about compromise. Now, this takes us to the third shade of culture for today, giving negative feedback. This is particularly tricky, and this is close to my mind, close to my heart, actually. Do you still remember our misconceptions? Good business practice in one culture will mean the same in another. And also, do you still remember that cultures are like onions and they have many layers? So let's have a look at 2 examples, this time from my life and from my practice. 2 students were given feedback by 2 college professors. Have a look at these. Your work falls below standard. The questionnaire has been poorly designed, and the use of examples without backing them up with arguments is totally unacceptable at this level. I strongly recommend that you rewrite your first draft. The second example. You have presented an interesting point of view. However, perhaps you could think about redesigning your questionnaire. I would suggest a slightly more direct approach. You're not quite there yet, but keep up the good work. Now, both of these professors use English. If you actually read between the lines, you will find out that both have the same meaning. Your work is not great. You have to make changes. You have to improve. You might have to rewrite things. But it's likely that both professors have different cultural backgrounds. Have a look at the first one. Where do you think this person comes from? What's your guess? I bet money on someone who's French, maybe Dutch, possibly Danish. And the second one, I would definitely go for an English speaker, someone who's British or American. Now, how do I know this? Because in my life, I've had contacts with both types of feedback. As a young person growing up in Poland attending primary school, I remember comments from my teachers looking like the first one. This is not great. Try again. However, in my life for 6 years, I worked as a secondary school teacher based in the south of England, and I was trained and taught to phrase my feedback to my students like the second professor. Actually, I was the person who was not allowed to use red pens and had to write everything in green. So the idea here was to praise, to give positive feedback, to encourage. Now, how you give and receive feedback could be closely linked to culture. It starts very early. It's the type of language that your parents use to you when you're a child, is the type of language you hear from your teachers. Going back to Erin Mayer, speaking frankly can be a gift to someone in one culture and a slap in the face in another. So let's have a look at the linguistic aspect. Let's have a look at these two examples in a bit more detail. Look at the linguistic element here, the words which I have highlighted. Falls below standard, poorly, totally, strongly. This is an example of negative feedback given in a direct way. And these words in linguistics, we actually call upgraders. They are intended to make the message stronger. In other words, to upgrade it. Have you ever heard from your teachers that your work was complete rubbish and they totally disagreed with you? Well, it can say something about where you come from. Of course, we're all individuals. We have different styles of giving feedback. That's true. But our culture can be responsible for this style. Now, research tells us that this type of feedback tends to be popular among people from such countries as Holland, Denmark, and Germany. These are examples of low context cultures, as we know, but also cultures where people value direct, honest, and open feedback. Now, be careful and make no mistake. Honest here doesn't mean offensive. Those of you who speak German might know the word Sachlichkeit, which means objectivity. It's not you who is judged, it's your work. Also notice that this type of feedback could be delivered in front of a group. Now, let's have a look at the second example in a little bit more detail. Have a look at the words underlined. Perhaps you could, I would suggest, slightly, not quite there yet, keep up the good work. This is an example of negative feedback given in a much more indirect way. And the highlighted words are examples of the so-called downgraders. They are intended to soften the message. This is a favorite technique of the British. Some of you might know the people who are famous for biting around the bush and not really going straight to the point. Now, this type of feedback should be given individually, as opposed to more direct equivalent. Think about your education. Think about the feedback you received from your teachers, instructors, your parents. It may speak volumes about your own culture. So, we've looked at the first scale, the communication scale. Now, let's have a look at the second one, the one about feedback. Now, the evaluating scale divides countries into two groups, those who prefer more direct negative feedback and those who prefer much more indirect one. Now, what you will see here is that towards the left end of the spectrum, you do have many European countries, Germany, Netherlands, Denmark. On the right-hand side, yet again, high context cultures, Asia, Middle East, Africa. Notice the position of some English-speaking countries, the US, the UK, or Canada. They're positioned somewhere right in the middle. Now, when it comes to feedback, a few simple words can make all the difference. If you are somebody who is supposed to comment on someone else's work and you have to give perhaps bad news to them, well, you have to answer the question why you're doing this. Maybe you're their manager, appraising them. This is called performance management. Well, obviously say and think about what you have to say, but more importantly than that, think about how you're going to do. Sometimes softening of the message by using a few downgraders could really make all the difference. So let us recap. We've looked at 3 different shades of cultures. What are some of the main takeaways for us here? Good practice has different meanings across cultures. In low context cultures, people are more direct and transparent. In high context cultures, however, words have many meanings. Reading between the lines, or listening to the air, as the Japanese say, is a skill to have. It's possible to say no by using a yes. How negative feedback is given can in fact be cultural. And finally, on the linguistic aspect, when we all use English to communicate, maybe it makes sense to think and learn how to use upgraders and downgraders. So this brings us to the 4th dimension. In other words, to the 5th shade of culture, how to disagree. Now, disagreeing, in fact, is giving feedback, of course, though on a much smaller scale. Disagreeing, in fact, by definition, is giving somebody immediate feedback. Challenging someone's position or idea can be productive. It can bring fresh ideas to the table. But being challenged could also mean that feelings got hurt, and people might even feel humiliated. Let me introduce another character to you today, Miss Lee Shannon. A little bit of context information or background information, so to speak, about Lee Shannon before we look at her example. Shen was a newly appointed marketing manager working for a large French company. She had excellent English skills. She was also a fluent French speaker. After a few months on the job, she was invited to France to deliver a presentation about some adjustments to the marketing strategy which could work better in China. As she recalls on her story, and her story is told by Erin Mayer once again, she had spent hours meticulously planning and polishing her presentation until it was spotless and perfect. What she perhaps wasn't prepared for was how much the French like to challenge the other's ideas. Let's have a look at her story, what happened during that presentation. It started with a question about why I had chosen a specific color in a print ad. As I explained my rationale, people began to challenge my decisions. I felt attacked and humiliated. They obviously didn't feel that I was the marketing expert that I claimed to be. I was almost in tears. Have a look at her words. She feels challenged, attacked, and humiliated. Her reputation is at stake here. Well, clearly people don't recognize who she is. She's a marketing director. So she's almost in tears. She's packing her stuff. She's ready to go. But let's see what happens next. Several of the participants, the ones who have just challenged me in front of a group, came up to congratulate me. They commented on how polished and interesting my presentation was. Now, this comes as a surprise. Disagreeing in France and challenging someone's idea, it's not to be taken seriously and personally. And then, perhaps for Lee, comes this eureka moment. I realized I was much more Chinese than I had thought. Now, being challenged in an honest and open way is not a Chinese way to disagree with someone. Let's look at some of the reasons for differences across cultures when it comes to disagreeing with somebody. Have you ever attended a dinner party in France? In France, Italy, or Spain, people aren't just expressive. They like confrontation and argument and challenges. However, once the emotions cool down and the political debate is over, everyone goes back to talking about food. Actually, in French schools, students are taught debating skills. They are shown how to build up logical arguments, and they are encouraged to challenge the ideas of others. Compare that perhaps to a Polish dinner table and a Polish school, when the teacher is still seen as an authority figure and it's not somebody to be challenged. What about a dinner party in England? Well, here the notion is very different. Be polite, make small talk, avoid the extremes, and stay superficial. Have you ever wondered why the English love talking about the weather so much? Well, because it's never extreme. It's hard to have a real argument over type weather, which is never too hot, neither too cold. They also love making small talk because intrinsically they tend to be quite shy, and they have a problem with managing long breaks in conversation and silence. With Brits, only once you've shared quite a few drinks, perhaps you can lay your hair down. So similarly to how you give or receive feedback, how you disagree, it often starts with education. But let's think about Lee Shannon once again, and let's learn 3 Mandarin words. Kaizen came from Japan. Mianzi comes from China. A lot of us have heard of the word Kaizen, popularized by the Toyota Corporation, where the word Zen means good, Kai means change, hence Kaizen, good change, improvement. Mianzi is a Chinese word which means your face. Your face means your reputation. It's to be preserved, it's to be saved, it's not to be lost. Guanxi is the relationship you have with other people, the network of your contact. And this is the mutual obligation and status you have. A boss and his employee, a husband and his wife, an older brother and a younger brother. They all have mutual relationships between them. Of course, also it's your social network. And Renqing, this is the exchange of favors which happens between people. This is something that we don't often quite get as Westerners. Now, let us have a look at this concept of Mianzi in a bit more detail, using another quote for today from Aaron Mayer. In China, protecting another person's face can be more important than stating what you believe is correct. Now, preserving group harmony, that's a big thing in many Asian cultures. Very different from the way we do things in the West, right? When everybody's individual and we live in our own bubble. Well, let's have a look at 2 more stories given by Aaron Mayer, somebody who's German and someone who is Japanese. Remember, we're thinking about how people disagree in different cultures. Dirk from Germany. We have this word in German, Sachlichkeit, objectivity. With it, we can separate someone's opinions or idea from the person expressing the idea. When I say I totally disagree, I'm debating your position, not disapproving of you. If we are challenging you, it's because we're interested. We just calmly provide our perspective in a rational manner. Sachlichkeit, objectivity, right? I'm not judging you, but I'm judging your idea. I'm honest with you because I care, and I do it in a rational, calm manner. What about Japan? Here in Japan, even asking another's point of view can feel confrontational in our culture. When you go around the table asking each guy on the team, what do you think about this? That can really take them off the guard. No one wants to be put on the spot in front of a bunch of people. Perhaps you think they will say, I entirely disagree with you. But as long as the boss is present, they will not. Your face, your reputation is precious. I will have to be very indirect and careful when I disagree with somebody from Japan or China. Now we've seen 2 scales, cultural scales to get today, given by Aaron Mayer. The communication one and the one about yes. Now, about the one about evaluating and feedback as well. Now, let us have a look at the 3rd one, looking at cultures in terms of how confrontational they really are. Now, notice that here things get interesting. Confrontational cultures, many of them are European, once again, Germany, Russia, Netherlands, Spain, and Italy. Countries which tend to avoid confrontation, well, quite often these are the Asian cultures. If we look at right in the middle of the scale, we can see both of the English-speaking countries. Now, if we think about Poland, where we probably are, right? Just give yourself a second to where you would position us on the list. Aaron Mayer doesn't actually include Poland here, right? Have a think. I would probably position Poland somewhere between Spain and Italy. That's my guess. Now, but this scale is yet another onion. It has more layers and it's not as straightforward as it might seem. Have a look on the second scale. Now, study Quadrant A just for a minute. Spain, France, Russia, Israel. Look at the vertical axis, expressiveness, and the horizontal one, how people are confrontational. In these cultures, people tend to be emotionally expressive. Spanish people or Italians, they're known for that. At the same time, they like challenging other people's ideas. In Quadrant D, things are also relatively simple. These are two Asian nations, Korea and Japan, but also two European nations, the UK and Sweden. The British, with their stereotypical view of biting around the bush, being indirect. The Swedes, who are often seen as introverts. Here people are not very expressive, and at the same time, they avoid confrontation. Now, the other two quadrants are trickier. In Quadrant B, we have cultures where people are confrontational. They will say no. They will give you direct negative feedback, but notice they're not really expressive. They will do it in a calm, polite, reserved manner. In Quadrant C, on the other hand, we can see many high context cultures where people avoid confrontation because it disrupts the harmony, but at the same time, they're seen as emotionally expressive. Everybody who has been to the Middle East, spent time in Egypt, must have seen people who were almost shouting at each other. Everything seemed like they were arguing, but if you ask another person to translate, you probably figure out that they were having a conversation, definitely in a more expressive way. So what are some solutions working with non-confrontational cultures? Well, if you are the boss, consider skipping the meeting. Remove yourself from the picture if you can. Let people know beforehand you will need their ideas. It will give them time to prepare. Consider not giving your opinion first because people will not challenge it. We know this now. Perhaps ask people to write their opinions and comments on sticky notes. Use this technique instead of regular brainstorming, going around the table and asking people, so what do you think about it? And finally, adjust your language. Perhaps avoid upgraders, throw in some more downgraders. It won't hurt. What about working with more confrontational cultures? People from Denmark, Holland, maybe Germany or France. Well, be careful not to use very strong language. As we said earlier on, it's tempting to be as direct as the other people, but this is also a skill to have. Not to offend people, but be on the same level. So just be careful. Now, a healthy debate doesn't mean open aggression. We all know this. And finally, remind yourself, and this can be very, very hard, being challenged by someone can in fact be a sign of engagement. It could mean that people are really listening to your ideas. So this takes us to the very last shade of culture for today, the perception of time. Now, the notion of time, the perception of this context, the values we attach to punctuality, how we worship or ignore schedules can also be shades of culture. And these can pose real challenges. Miscommunication, and they can help to build up frustration. In our final section for today, this is the fifth shade of culture, we will try to answer the question of why time is not a universal context and how to deal with some of these issues. And let me introduce to you the very last character in our scenarios, Dr. Ahmed Asideh. His story was also illustrated by Erin Mayer, taken from her research. Dr. Asideh is originally from Nigeria. He's an executive in a large African bank. He has experience of working both with Nigerians and Germans. And at some point, he was invited to a conference in Germany. Let's have a look at what happened to him 3 months before the event. Last week, 3 months before a conference I will attend in Germany, I received an email asking me to choose dinner options. Now, how can I be expected to know now in January what I'm going to have for dinner on April 6th? Things are always changing in Nigeria. I am from a Muslim part of the country. We don't even know when the holiday is going to start until the supreme leader looks at the moon and says so. My German colleagues don't get it and take offense. Now, it might sound like a funny story, right? But I think it does illustrate a valid point. The way we look at time, schedules, might be completely different depending on the culture we come from. Now, we have all heard these stereotypes. Greeks are lazy. Spanish people, never on time. Nigerians, super slow, chaotic. The reasons for such oversimplifications are many. It could be the social system of the country, the religion, how developed the country is. What is the climate like? It could also obviously have something to do with individual differences. These all play a role. But long story cut short, time is not a universal concept. So what is time really? A straight line or a twisting one? If you remember the marriage metaphor we used earlier on, the newlyweds, remember that? Now, that metaphor was actually created by an American anthropologist and sociologist, Edward T. Hall. The same anthropologist worked out a concept of time as linear and flexible. Let's have a look at some cultures and features of these two different categories. So linear time. These are cultures which see time as a resource. So look at the language we use. Time is something we can buy, we can spend it, we can waste it, we can save it, kill, or invest it. We can do things with it in an active way. We love punctuality and scheduling. Timetables are everywhere. We tend to do one thing at a time. And also, our meetings have agendas and time limits, deadlines. So what about cultures where time is flexible? Here, the notion of time is something much more fluid. People need to be adaptable. Changes are common. Being late might be acceptable. Remember, the world is not a static place. Many things can happen at the same time, and meetings often tend to lack visible structure. If you think about it, people from flexible time cultures, Nigeria, India, well, we often think they're chaotic or disorganized. Maybe through our own cultural lens and perspective, they are. How do they see us? Well, I've often heard that we are not flexible and we can't adapt. So how you see time can vary depending on your culture. But why? Let's pause and for a minute think about the big picture. Now, this is not really about time, but this is about the big picture of how and where we live. Compare and take a highly industrialized, developed country such as Germany. Life and schedules seem somehow important. Our life is fixed. Things are reliable. Your boss is expected at 8 a.m. in the morning. There is a paper timetable on the wall. and the bust will come at, let's say, 9:03. Stability and predictability are all around. Think about another culture. Take Sri Lanka, Nigeria, or Ecuador as an example, where environment is a lot more dynamic. Life is unpredictable. As governments often change, so do their regulations and financial systems. Inflation means prices constantly go up or down. Life conditions are fragile. Yesterday, you enjoyed a hot shower. Today, there is a shortage of running water. The change is constant. Going to this concept of a rubber band, well, life is tense in Germany. Lives are bound by schedules, by timetables and contracts. In these countries, time is linear. On the other hand, here, the rubber band usually hangs loosely. Flexing, stretching it, won't really change things. Time and ourselves, we have to be flexible. Now, getting into the big picture means that perception of time, again, is just an element in a much larger frame. Have you ever struggled with meetings with your colleagues from India or perhaps some African countries or the Middle East? There's no one agenda. People constantly add things, and sometimes you want to scream. In flexible time cultures, productive meetings grow in unpredictable ways. Good managers are seen as people who are flexible and know how to take advantage of interruptions, changes to the agenda. In linear time cultures, well, that's much easier to handle. There's one thing at a time. If somebody tries to jump in or hijack, well, we can always ask them to take these things offline. What about contracts? In Europe, we love the written stuff. If you want to hire a bicycle in Warsaw, Berlin, or London, be prepared to spend 20 minutes reading and signing documents, the insurance policy, the terms and conditions. There will be penalties if you break them. In the developing countries, contracts and relationships go together. There's a simple reason for that. They don't have the legal systems we do. Someone cheats you, your supplier doesn't pay you, it might not make sense to take them to court because it won't work. So it depends on mutual trust. People build their networks. People take time to get to know each other. You get to know somebody, you do business, you recommend them to someone else. You use trust to depend on the other person. So the scheduling scale, right? The last scale we're going to look at, linear time countries, right? Notice Germany, Switzerland, Japan as well, a high context culture where people value being on time, punctuality. Notice again, many high context cultures towards the right far end of the scale. Notice where Poland is. Again, on most of these scales, I have a growing feeling that Poland is to be found somewhere in the middle. And I think this makes us a unique business partner. People who have the experience of both, who are not so far away from the other extreme end of the scale. So what about some solutions? Time can be an issue. We've all struggled with it, right? Well, unfortunately, it's often trial and error, how you handle time in other cultures. A lot will depend on your role. Consider this, if you're just a visitor and you spend a few days or weeks in another country, try to adapt. To use the famous proverb, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. But if you were a leader or a manager, perhaps establish a clear and explicit team culture. Maybe have a clear discussion about scheduling systems up front if you know that time might be an issue. Now, let me be very specific on this one here. In the world of geographically dispersed teams, at the time of this pandemic, when we work remotely, this can be really difficult. So, today in our webinar, we have looked at 5 shades of culture, 5 different dimensions or challenges. And before we look at some questions that you might have, let's just recap and look at some of the takeaways from them. Let's call them the 8 commandments. Low and high context cultures differ mainly in directness and transparency. Now we know this. it pays off to build relationships with the so-called coconut cultures. Yes has many meanings. No, on the other hand, can be phrased in different ways. Direct communication doesn't always mean the same as direct negative feedback. In some cultures, open disagreement is a sign of engagement. Time, as we have seen, and as we probably all know, is not a universal context. As a leader, you can establish a clear and explicit team culture. And don't forget that. We talked about onions. Working across cultures can be an amazing experience, which enriches our skills and brings quality to our life, but it's often trial and error. You live and learn. So let's take this further, right? I'm leaving here some of my contact details for those of you who might have very specific questions and would like to ask some questions. But in the meantime, I'll ask Agnieszka maybe to have a look at some of the questions that have been asked, or maybe some of you have questions. And let's perhaps try to use the rest of this situation to think about it, right? So thank you for your attention.
Okay, yes, we have one question from Daria. What would be the best way to prepare for a meeting with the business partners representing different context cultures?
This is an interesting question. Now, I think that it's probably about finding a compromise and finding a middle way. If we, for example, know that there are people here who come from the so-called high context cultures and they value that opportunity, interaction, bond building, maybe let's introduce this formula of maybe not even a team building activity, but this opportunity for people to engage in small talk. Maybe I wouldn't even risk saying this concept of speed dating where you have a chance to walk around the room and ask questions, but maybe to include that element. But at the same time, perhaps people who come from a low context culture and they will definitely value structure, well, make sure there is an agenda, right? Make sure that you, for example, send a follow-up email so that, well, we keep both of these groups as happy as they can be. That will be my answer. Thank you for that question. It was a very good one.
Okay, I don't see more questions. Guys, if you have some questions, please write it on chat. This is a great moment for it, or in the Q&A section. But I think all is clear and we don't have more questions. So thank you so much, Jakub, for sharing your knowledge and your experience. Personally, I find it very interesting and very useful. And thank you, everyone, for your participation. We hope you've had enjoyed this meeting. And if you are interested in our upcoming events, check out our Facebook or find us on meetup.com. And I hope we will see you again in the nearest future. Thank you so much.
Agnieszka, I'll just pause you for a second because I've noticed there is a question which has just popped up in the questioning button. And the question, if I read it, says, do you think that people from Asian cultures put as much effort as we to understand other cultures? This is a very good question. Personally, I have a problem with that. Meaning I have had many contacts with people from the Middle East in my life, and I feel that we are often pressurized into adapting, to accommodate some behaviors, and we often think, well, think about them, think about people from another part of the world. To answer this question, I am not sure. I have a feeling that as here in Europe, we do talk and think about cultures a lot, and we often look for business partners worldwide. Well, we might actually, we might put perhaps more effort than other nations, but this would be really, really hard to say because it's also due to some individual differences. But I'm not sure. I can see that this question came from Karol, so maybe Karol has some experience to do with that. But like I said, yes, we tend to talk and think a lot about culture and these differences and our awareness here. Sadly, unfortunately, in some occasions, this might not be the same for people on the other side. So yes, thank you for that question.
Okay, thank you for your question, and I think we will finish now.
Sure.
So
sure.
Thank you so much again, and see you soon.
Thanks again. Again, guys, if you have any questions, feel free to send a message or an email. Thank you. Bye-bye.